So Coleridge had probably completed Kubla Khan by 1797. He wrote it during one of the most fertile times of his life when he was spending time in Somerset and Netherstowey hiking the Quantock Mountains with Dorothy and William Wordsworth. It was during this time when William and Samuel put together what is probably the most important literary work of the Romantic Age, Lyrical Ballads, published in 1798. In this collection, Lyrical Ballads, we first see Coleridge's great poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Kubla Khan did not make this collection. No one really quite knows why, but one theory is that Coleridge simply didn't know what it was. What kind of poem was it? Was it a nature poem written from a first-person perspective, like Wordsworth's great nature lyrics? No. Was it some sort of spooky ballad like Coleridge wrote in Rime of the Ancient Mariner? No. It seemed beyond classification. And indeed, some of Coleridge's closest friends thought this as well. They just would hear the poem and it was mesmerizing and enchanting, but it didn't seem to have any meaning in a traditional literary sense. So what happens? Between 1797 and 1816, well, a lot happens with Coleridge, most of it bad, but the poem circulates orally. Coleridge is very active in the literary scene in London, and he's often called upon to recite the poem. People know about it. It's like a greatest hit, and he's something of a rock star when it comes to poetry, and folks would gather around him, and he would close his eyes and tilt his head up ever so slightly, almost as if he himself were falling into a trance, and he would recite the poem. Well, luckily, at one of these gatherings was Lord Byron. Lord Byron, much younger than Coleridge, had just published Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and was famous. At this point, he could have done anything he wanted to in the literary world. And Byron loved Kubla Khan. He was enchanted by it, just as many people were. So he offered to arrange for his publisher to publish Kubla Khan. So in 1816, Kubla Khan sees light for the first time. It's published along with two other poems of Coleridge, Christabel and The Pains of Sleep. Well, one way to think about Kubla Khan is that it explores three different ways of making, three different models of, let's say, creativity. The preface to the poem, in which Coleridge talks about how he, during a dream, heard most of the poem recited, only to be awakened from the dream before the poem was finished speaking itself. And therefore, when he actually sat down to write the poem, he could only recall parts of it from the dream, and the rest floated away like fragments in water. So the preface highlights creativity. Where does a poem come from? Well, the preface famously suggests that the greatest poems come spontaneously in states of dream or reverie. There's also a suggestion that Coleridge was taking opium when this dream took place. Well, look at the first stanza. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless demand down to the sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled around. And there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. So Kubla Khan is a maker. He decrees as a god would decree. He speaks into being this pleasure dome. And notice the pleasure dome is geometrically exact, twice 5 miles of fertile ground. It is very well laid out. It's very well designed. It features harmony, symmetry. It's a place that is comfortable, paradisal, almost like an Eden. There's no wildness. There is no unkemptness. However, near this pleasure dome, this self-contained realm of perfect beauty almost, is the river Alph that runs down caverns measureless demand down to a sunless sea. So this is another realm entirely, a realm that is beyond measure, a realm that is not full of life and greenery. So there's a suggestion that the pleasure dome ignores or cuts out or represses this other part of existence, which is chaos, which is darkness. And the second part of the poem seems to suggest another model of creativity that is more on the side of chaos, that is more on the side of the abysmal forces of nature. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place as holy and enchanted as e'er beneath a waning moon was haunted by a woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermittent bursts huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail or chaffy grain beneath a thresher's flail. So what happens here? You have this this chasm, and out of the chasm springs this water, and out of this water comes destruction, but also creation. And the water is associated with demonic forces, forces that are dark, that are other, that are strange. And also, it's worth noting that this water geysering up out of this chasm brings together opposites, brings together order and chaos, life and death, whereas the dome of Kubla Khan seems to value order alone. So, what happens? By the time we get to the third stanza, there's yet another creator. Kubla Khan is creator in the first part, nature itself is creator in the second part. In the third part, we have this damsel with a dulcimer. In a vision once the poet saw, it was an Abyssinian maid, on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. So it seems that this dream maiden on the surface is very much on the side of order, predictability. She has a dulcimer, which is a fairly small instrument that doesn't make a very deep, rich sound. And she is singing. Again, this also suggests a kind of order and predictability. But notice that she is an Abyssinian maid. She comes from Abyssinia, but also she is of the abyss. So there's a way in which this maiden brings together the abysmal forms of the deep romantic chasm and the more delightful, orderly forms of the pleasure dome. And she sings a symphony. Could I revive within me her symphony and song? A symphony suggesting a gathering of diversity, unity and diversity brought together. Sounds that are brought together, symphony. This becomes a kind of ideal poet who can bring together the two sides. And the poet himself in this poem, the eye of the poem says, if I could revive within me her symphony and song, to such delight would win me that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice. And all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware. His flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle around him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. So the poet at the end imagines himself hypothetically as a sacred poet. Sacred coming from the Latin sacere, which means both holy and accursed. So he himself becomes a poet of duplicity, bringing together the opposing forces of nature into this powerful harmony. And as such, he is awe-inspiring, quite literally. He breeds fear and fascination at the same time. So the poem explores three different models of creativity, two of which seem to be graspable, but each of which is somewhat limited. The third model of creativity seems to be ideal and dreamlike, but a state toward which one might aspire.